When you think about the great wars of the 20th century, you probably picture tanks, trenches, and battleships. But there was another war happening, a battle fought not on land or sea, but inside people's minds. Today, we're going to break down how information itself was turned into one of the most powerful weapons of all. Let's get into it.
This quote just says it all, doesn't it? Total war meant you couldn't just mobilize an army. You had to mobilize an entire nation's will to fight. It was about convincing millions of people that their cause was just, their sacrifice was necessary, and the enemy was an evil that had to be destroyed. It wasn't just about soldiers. It was about hearts and minds.
So that's the big question we're tackling here. How does it actually happen? I mean, how can a poster or a radio broadcast become as deadly as a bullet? How do you turn simple words and pictures into weapons that can shape the course of history? Well, we're going to find out by looking at the playbook that was basically invented during World War I and then perfected in World War II. Okay, so before we dive into the actual posters and films, we've got to understand the thinking behind them. This wasn't just a bunch of random creative ideas. Oh no, this was a science. These campaigns were built on some really specific and, frankly, kind of scary psychological theories. This was psychological warfare, plain and simple. The word to really focus on here is systematic. Propagandists saw themselves as engineers of opinion. Their whole job was to methodically build the perfect psychological environment for war, to get people at home fired up and to demoralize the enemy. It's all about creating the conditions for victory. So the whole playbook really starts with guys like Gustave Le Bon. His big idea was that when people are in a large group or crowd, they stop thinking for themselves. Reason goes out the window, and raw emotion takes over. Now, for a propagandist, this was a goldmine. It meant you didn't have to win a logical argument, you just had to tap into basic feelings, fear, pride, hatred. That was the real key. And then you add this into the mix. With new technologies like radio and mass-produced newspapers, this really powerful idea called the magic bullet theory emerged. The thinking was that the media was like a hypodermic needle. You could craft the perfect message and just inject it straight into the public's brain. The audience was seen as totally passive, totally defenseless. A pretty terrifying concept, right? So how did they actually do it? Well, a political scientist named Harold Lasswell basically cataloged all the common tricks, creating what's essentially a propagandist toolkit. It's got all the greatest hits. First, you use name-calling to dehumanize the enemy, make them seem like monsters. Then, you use glittering generalities, big, vague, positive words like freedom and justice that nobody can disagree with. Third, the bandwagon effect. You create this feeling that everyone is on board, so you better join in too. And finally, card stocking. You just cherry-pick the facts that support your side and completely ignore everything else. All right, so we've got the theory, we've got the playbook. Now let's see its first big test drive. World War I became this massive real-world experiment for these new psychological weapons. For the first time, governments were using these tools on a global scale. So picture this. Britain is in a really tough spot. They desperately need America to join the war, but America wants nothing to do with it. So the British propaganda machine was given one single gigantic mission: change America's mind. And their strategy was to paint the Germans as complete and utter savages, the barbaric Hun. And you can just watch their strategy unfold, step by step. It starts in 1914 with stories of German atrocities in Belgium, many of them exaggerated or outright fabricated, but published in official-looking reports to seem legit. Then, in 1915, a German U-boat sinks the passenger ship Lusitania. British propaganda frames it as a pure act of barbarism, not an act of war. And you know what? It worked. By 1917, American public opinion had totally shifted. The U.S. entered the war and immediately set up its very own propaganda agency. Now, on the other side, German propaganda had a very different, and you could argue even more poisonous legacy. When Germany lost, a powerful myth took hold: the stab in the back. The lie was that the German army was never actually beaten on the battlefield. They were betrayed by politicians and enemies at home. This one single idea would fester and poison German politics for years, really paving the way for what came next. So if World War I was the first draft, World War II was the perfected, terrifyingly efficient final product. This is where propaganda was industrialized. It became a machine, and nowhere was that machine more powerful than in Nazi Germany. And the chief architect of this machine was Joseph Goebbels. His Ministry of Propaganda didn't just try to influence the news. It was the news. It had absolute, total control over everything. We're talking every movie, every radio broadcast, every newspaper, every piece of art. There was no escape. They created a total information bubble. So let's look under the hood of this machine. First, they built an incredible cult of personality around Hitler, presenting him as this flawless, almost godlike figure who could save Germany. Second, they used movies like The Eternal Jew to systematically dehumanize Jewish people, portraying them as subhuman. This laid the psychological foundation for the Holocaust. To get the message out, they pushed the cheap People's Receiver radio into almost every home, literally piping Nazi ideology into living rooms 24/7. And finally, they used incredible, stunning visuals in films like Triumph of the Will to make their hateful ideology seem powerful, unified, and even beautiful. It was chillingly effective. So you've got this all-consuming propaganda machine in Germany. How in the world do you fight back against that? Well, the Allies realized they couldn't just win on the battlefield. They had to win the war of ideas, too. And I mean, when you put them side by side, the contrast is just stark. The Nazi goal was total control, pushed through a single monolithic ideology focused on racial purity and the cult of Hitler. The Allied response was to frame the war as a fight for something: freedom, democracy, a just war against evil. It was a direct clash of worldviews. To fight this war of ideas, America deployed one of its secret weapons: Hollywood. The US government actually hired one of the most famous directors of the time, Frank Capra, to create a series of films called Why We Fight. And get this, these movies weren't even for the general public. They were mandatory viewing for millions of American GIs, designed to explain exactly what they were fighting for and the totalitarian nightmare they were fighting against.
Okay, so after all of that, what's the bottom line here? First, propaganda isn't just a side project in a war, it's a core military weapon. It completely erases the line between the soldier on the front and the family back home. Everyone's a target. Its main job is to demonize the enemy so that ordinary people can justify extraordinary brutality. And maybe most importantly, it's always evolving, latching on to the newest technology to get inside our heads.
And that kind of leaves us with one final pretty big question. The technology has obviously changed a lot. We've gone from leaflets and radio to social media, AI, and viral videos. But the fundamental playbook, the techniques of name-calling, of creating a bandwagon, of stacking the deck, you really have to ask yourself, are these exact same battles for our minds still being fought every single day right on the screens in our hands?